Hi everyone. So Kerry has really covered, the start of the review up to the method section, and I'm going to cover the results section onwards. So what I'm going to present, once again, I just want to emphasize this is what we're looking for from an editorial perspective. So when I present, all the different ways that the evidence can be presented, I'm not going to be giving details on how to create this presentation. It's more just from an editorial point of view, this is what I expect to see when I come to look at a review of a network meta-analysis. So when we think about the effects of intervention section, there's an awful lot of information that needs to be presented for each outcome, and it can sometimes seem like an impossible task, but it is possible. The most important thing, though, that we really want to see is consistency. So for each of the outcomes that is presented in the effects of intervention section, ideally, we'd like to see a map of the evidence for each outcome, the intervention effects presented in a concise and a comprehensible way, possibly the ranking presented in a concise and comprehensible way. Ranking is actually optional, but it is still very helpful to do. An indication of the heterogeneity or incoherence in the network, and also the certainty of the evidence. So we're going to just take you through each one of these one by one and show the different options that we might expect to see for each. So if we think first of all about did the authors map the evidence in the network, the most common way we see this is the authors presenting a network diagram that looks similar to this, as well as a summary of the network diagram in the text of the review. So that's great, that's all we want to see. And the network diagram, I won't go into too much detail because I think it has been covered in other webinars, but it basically just shows all the evidence that's available, and the nodes, which are those circles, they show the amount of the amount of evidence available for each intervention, so the number of participants, for example. And the lines between each of the circles shows the amount of direct comparisons available between each intervention. So looking at this network diagram, it's telling you that oxytocin was the agent that was most frequently investigated, and the comparison that was most frequently investigated directly was oxytocin versus misoprostol. Now, a network plot like that one, it's a very pleasant way to look at the map of the evidence, but it's not always feasible, especially if you have a huge number of different interventions or different study designs. So when it's not really feasible, it is possible to map the evidence by presenting a table like the one we see here, where the different columns represent the different interventions and the different rows represent the different study designs in terms of the interventions being compared. And a third option that we see when people are trying to map the evidence is a contribution matrix. So this would show the percentage of information that the direct evidence contributes to each relative effect estimated in the network meta-analysis. So in the example we see here, you can see each of the columns is showing the direct comparison to the network, and each of the rows is showing the percentage each relative effect was estimated in the network meta-analysis. So if this would maybe be a preferred option if the review authors have also assessed the certainty of the evidence using the cinema technique by Salanti and colleagues. So I'll touch on assessing the certainty a little bit later in this, but that's just an example of why maybe a contribution matrix would be a helpful addition. But in terms of just from an editorial perspective, all we really want is to see one of these three options, just knowing that the evidence has been mapped in some way, preferably as a network diagram, but if not, a table or a contribution matrix is equally viable. The next question we ask is, have the authors presented the intervention effects in a concise and comprehensible way? So again, this is not an easy thing to do when you're talking about the results of a network meta-analysis because there's so much information, but it is still possible. We have, again, we can just do a forest plot like the one we see here, and summarise the results of the forest plot in the text, along with the risk ratios and the confidence intervals and so forth. Or an alternative way to present the intervention effects is as a league table, like the one we see here, which presents the direct, indirect, and the network summary relative effects along with their confidence ratings. So, and this league table is actually showing two different outcomes at once. So if we look at all of the cells, the little squares in the bottom left corner, so the bottom left triangle, that's showing the evidence related to PASI 90, which is a psoriasis area severity index. So it's a measure of psoriasis. And then the top right corner of the table, those above that top triangle, is showing the evidence related to serious adverse effects. And then it's just a case of tracking the two comparisons you're interested in. So if you're looking at AIL 17 versus AIL 23, and you wanted to know what the serious adverse effect result was in that comparison, you can see it's 1.47 with a confidence interval of 0.98 to 220. So that's a perfectly viable alternative to presenting a forest plot. And again, we just, as long as one of the two is there, the absence of either of these would be a red flag, but as long as we see one of these two, we're happy. Next, we want to know, did the authors present the ranking in a concise and comprehensible way? So presenting the ranking, it is optional. It's not a mandatory feature of a network meta-analysis, but it is a very helpful feature to present. And if it is included in the review, one of the most common ways we see it is as a rankogram, like this figure 6 here on the right. And we can see from this, looking at this figure, that this light orange line is representing the highest ranked agent, which was ergometrine plus oxytocin combination. An alternative to presenting a rankogram is to just summarize and describe the mean ranks and the sucra in the text of the review. So sucra stands for surface under cumulative ranking curve. Now again, there's a lot more detail on how to calculate and create all of this evidence and all of these analyses in other webinars, the handbook, and there's a lot of resources, so that we're not going into details about that today. But basically, if authors have done ranking in a review, we want to see it presented either as a rankogram or as a series of mean ranks and sucra in the text. We also want to see, for each outcome, did the authors present the level of heterogeneity and incoherence? So this is usually expressed via the magnitude of the between study variance tau squared and summarized in the p-value of the chi-squared statistic in coherence test and the I-squared statistic for incoherence. So again, chapter 10 in the handbook should provide more detail in this, but in this example of the review, we can see that they have a statement there that does clarify there was evidence of global inconsistency, as seen by the p-value of 0.046. So authors have referred to global inconsistency and they give the p-value, which is what we're looking for. And then finally, for each outcome, we want to know what the certainty of the evidence is. So when we're talking about a network meta-analysis, it is a little bit more complex than a normal pairwise analysis. And ideally, we want to see, first of all, what is the confidence that authors have in each pairwise comparison. And to assess that, they can just use grades, just as grade as we all know it. But grade has also now been extended, and there are now two approaches for extending grades into a network meta-analysis. And those two approaches, the first one is called CINEMA, which is confidence in network meta-analysis, very simple, by Salanti and colleagues. And there's an alternative approach called by Puhan and colleagues. So again, previous webinars have gone into assessing the certainty of evidence in a lot more detail. From an editorial point of view, all we want to know is, has the pairwise comparison certainty been assessed as well as the certainty of the network? And was the certainty of the network assessed using either cinema or Pewhen? So the absence of either cinema or Pewhen, for example, would be a red flag. But in the example we see in the screen, it's a very nice example because they separated out with subheadings, and we love subheadings. The first one using grade to look at the treatment estimates, and then using cinema to look at the network intervention estimates. So that's what we hope and expect to see in the effects of intervention section. And next I'm going to cover what we hope and expect to see in the summary of findings tables. So the summary of findings tables is, again, it's very difficult and complex knowing how best to present the evidence from a network meta-analysis in a concise and comprehensible way as a summary of findings. I don't think there's any agreed mandatory way in which this evidence must be presented. There are some options, and there are some really helpful papers that show some of the best options, which I would highly recommend that you read. From an editorial point of view, though, the questions we're asking are, first of all, did the authors think carefully about which outcomes and which comparisons they have decided to present in the summary of findings tables? And the choice of outcomes and comparisons should be based on what is the most important information for decision makers. And it should not be based on what is the most interesting result or what do we have the most amount of evidence about. So in this review, they specifically said they would present the primary review outcomes, which makes sense, obviously, because they would be the most important, and the important side effects, which is good because we want the table to be balanced. We want it to be a mixture of outcomes of benefit and outcomes of harm. However, it would be better still if they could clarify in advance what are the important side effects. And likewise, this review has also specified that they will be presenting the most effective drugs in comparison with the most frequently used and recommended drug, oxytocin. So they have a clear plan for which comparisons, and they have a good rationale for why they've chosen those comparisons. So that's what we want to see. We also want to know if they have thought in advance about how they're going to assess the confidence of how they're going to assess their confidence in the evidence. So similar to the previous slides, assessing the confidence both within the pairwise comparisons, but also within the network. So this example on screen talks about using the grade criteria, and it focuses mainly on the confidence within the pairwise comparisons. So to be fair, this review was published a few years ago, and I think that the approaches for extending the grade into network meta-analysis have been developing more since then. So at the time, this was probably appropriate, but now we would expect to see reference as well to either cinema or Pewhen to assess the certainty within the network as well as within the pairwise comparisons. The third question we ask about the summary findings tables is did they present the outcomes and comparisons they plan to? And in this case, we're pleased to see they did. They have the 3 comparisons they referred to presented as columns, and they have the PPH is their primary outcomes, and they also have what they consider to be the most important side effects, so vomiting, hypertension, and fever. So it's good they have adhered to the plan they made in the protocol. This is only one way in which this evidence can be presented. These authors were able to get the 3 most important comparisons and the 5 most important outcomes all in the one table, which is great. And if it's possible, it's a very nice, pleasant, and concise way to look at all the information. But that's often not always possible. So an alternative option would be to create a different summary findings table for each important outcome. So this is an example table from a different review where they separated out and where they had each table just focused on a single outcome. So this table is looking at serious adverse effects, and then each row is the comparison of interest. And a third option is an interactive electronic display so that the user can actually choose what they want to emphasize, so which comparisons for which outcome and so forth. This is the sort of thing that's currently in development. I don't know if it's finalized yet. I don't think I've seen a very good final version yet, but I think it's something that's in the future, and it will be a much more helpful way of presenting this evidence. So we're all looking forward to seeing that. And just to emphasize these examples, we have 5 comparisons in that table. We had 3 comparisons in the previous table. When there's more than 5 interventions or 5 comparisons, it does get a lot more difficult because it's hard to know what to present. And you can see this in the handbook. It goes into more detail, but it really emphasizes the fact that authors have to prioritize. They have to think carefully and select and report a smaller number of comparisons with a good, clear rationale. And the rationale must be based on what is important, so whether it's these are the interventions that are of direct interest for the conclusions, or these are the interventions that are most important for clinical practice. It can't just be we chose these interventions because they had statistically significant results or they had lots of participants. It has to have a good, clear rationale. And also in terms of the choice of comparator, it's important to flag that in a summary findings table, obviously we have to consider what the reference comparator is that each of the interventions is being compared against. And again, some good rationales for choosing the comparator would be if there's a very common placebo intervention that it could be compared against, if there is currently a gold standard that everyone assumes is the best option, if there's what is known to be the most cost-effective intervention, or perhaps what is currently known to be the least effective intervention. So again, it's important to make sure the choice of interventions has a clear rationale, but also the choice of comparator. And then the final question from an editorial point of view that we ask about the summary of findings tables is just, does it adhere to all the other standard recommendations that we expect to see? So these are all the usual things that we're always looking for. The PICO row has to be accurate and informative, outcomes fully defined, all the data present and correct, and any measures of certainty presented and also justified, either with footnotes or by explaining in the box. And then also just on the subject of tables, again, network meta-analysis are very tricky because they often involve a huge number of tables and figures, and there are only so many that we can fit into a review. So when the number of figures and tables does start to get unmanageable, we always think it's best to encourage people to only focus on presenting critical figures and tables in the actual review, and then use online science depository systems for the rest, like these options on the screen. And then finally, the last thing is the abstract. So we have the abstract at the end of this presentation because, again, from an editorial point of view, it's the last thing we look at, and it should be the last thing the authors actually complete. So even though it's the first thing you read, we think it makes more sense that it's the last thing you look at when you're assessing a review. So for an abstract of a network meta-analysis, all of the usual standards apply. There's very little difference. We still want to see a good rationale and context, the date of the search. There are a few things that have to be emphasized a little bit more. For example, the objectives of the review, we still expect it to be presented in a single concise sentence. However, as Kerry touched on earlier, the objective of a network meta-analysis really must include the word network meta-analysis and ranking, if ranking actually took place in the review. But because ranking is optional, it's also optional to present it in the objectives. In this example we see here, for example, really the objective should have said network meta-analysis, as opposed to generator ranking. There should have actually been the words network meta-analysis in that objective. Likewise, one of the messier standards suggests that all noteworthy methods must be summarized in the abstract, and obviously The fact that it was a network meta-analysis is a very noteworthy method, so that must be somewhere in the abstract. And then the most difficult part of writing an abstract for a network meta-analysis is when we're trying to when we're coming to the main results, because obviously Messier states that all the important outcomes must be summarized, and by important outcomes, usually what we mean is the summary of findings tables outcomes. So we expect the summary of findings tables and the abstract and the PLS to mirror one another. All three should be summarizing the same outcomes because they were pre-chosen as the most important outcomes. The problem is, of course, that this becomes a very difficult task whenever you're trying to present the very complex results of a network meta-analysis. And there might just be too many different comparisons and outcomes and data that was presented in your summary of findings tables to summarize everything in the abstract. So at the moment, the best advice that we can give is to really encourage authors to think very, very carefully about what is the most important information that key decision makers need to know about. So take the summary of findings table, and if it's possible, try and summarize the evidence, including statistical analyses and in making sure that it's presented in an interpretable way. But if it's just not possible to get all of that information in the abstract and stay under 1,000 words, then it might be necessary to prioritize even further and only choose maybe one key outcome of benefit and one key outcome of harm from the summary findings tables and use the abstract to summarize them. But I mean, the best option that authors could take here is to consult with key stakeholders, because they're the ones who can best advise on what key decision makers need to know. And then very finally, just want to flag that often the protocol may plan for a network meta-analysis, but like Kerry mentioned earlier, sometimes it's not always possible. There could be many reasons why this could happen. There might not be as many studies as expected, or maybe the authors realize they're just not confident that the transitivity assumption has not been violated, and overall they decide they can't do a network meta-analysis and they will just do a normal pairwise analysis. And there's nothing wrong with that. Caution is always a good thing. The important thing, though, when we're looking at a review from an editorial perspective, is that they have not just deleted all those methods and made no reference to them. Those methods must remain in the review, because it might be in the future, during one of the next updates, it is going to be possible to do a network meta-analysis, and we need to have those methods ready to go. So, for example, this example on the screen, it's explained in the objectives that the objective was to do a network meta-analysis. It wasn't possible, and so all of the methods have been moved to an appendix, which is a much more appropriate way to present. So those are just a summary of the very high-level questions that we as editors would ask ourselves when going through a review. And like we said at the start, saying no to any of those questions, it doesn't mean it's wrong, it just means it needs a bit more investigation. And there are several resources that we really do recommend you look at. So we have all the handbook chapters and all this training, the recordings, and there's also a number of really helpful references that go into a lot more detail.